Hello, I'm Judy Stiles. Thank you for joining us this week on Newsmakers. Well, world news catches our attention many times, and today I'm honored to have our guest, Dr. Conrad Gubera, who's been with me on the program before, talking about the Middle East. I know we talked last time after you had visited Saudi Arabia, so I welcome you and thank you for coming back, because people are talking about what's happening over there in the Middle East these days.
Judy, it's always a pleasure to be with you. I thank you for your invitation.
And
what's happening in the Middle East? Really, no one seems to know. I mean, it's not the Middle East of 20 years ago, to be sure, and it doesn't have the stability. And in the wake of, American and other incursions into the Middle East, where we're going to spread, as Vice President Cheney said, freedom and democratic republicanism, in the wake of all that, we have a tremendous problem in the Middle East now, perhaps maybe even greater than it was before.
It's a lot of unrest, a lot of concerns. Headlines as we're recording this program, first part of October, they're talking about problems in Syria and the refugees. That's really kind of the key story right now we're hearing so much about. Just recently, Russia getting involved over there. Americans are probably wondering, so what does this mean for us? Russia's taking a side. Are we taking a side? How does this all play together?
Well, Judy, my pointer's right, and if it shows up, here's Syria. And I've spent considerable time in Syria back in the 90s, and Damascus, Homs isn't on the map, and Aleppo, beautiful city. And they're practically destroyed as far as the civil war and the fighting is concerned. This is where I understand the Russians are, flying about 100 sorties in the last 3 days, according to National Public Radio. This is where ISIS would be. The Kurds would be up in this particular area here, but ISIS is right in here as far as northern Iraq. This is Iraq, and eastern Syria. The major part of the fighting in Syria has been on the west side here, and so frankly, there isn't that much of a urban population, or this just land out here, really. And so ISIS has sort of been kind of clever about, villages and small towns and people like this in the same way, really, as far as northern Iraq is concerned. Of course, Mosul, we know ISIS controls that city, see? And so here you have Syria, and for the last 3 years, they've had this internal warfare where the people that certainly rose up against the Assad regime in Syria, have become the political refugees.
Right.
Today there are roughly 4 million refugees that have come out of Syria, and they've gone into Lebanon. And Lebanon now has some huge refugee camps. And of course, they always drift down toward Jordan. And Jordan, I think, should get the Nobel Peace Prize someday as a country, because they've housed more refugees than just about any other country in the world, as far as I know. And are still housing something like 2 million refugees here in Jordan that are Palestinians that want ever so much to go back over to the Palestinian territory right here, as far as the West Bank of the Jordan is concerned. The Syrian refugees, come to either Jordan or Lebanon, and those that are further north try to take off for Turkey to make contacts in the west coast of Turkey, and then eventually, for instance, to get to Greece, and then certainly up into southeast Europe. Here, of course, is Romania and Hungary, where they've really reached the real snafu as far as their land travels are concerned. The idea is to get to Germany, because they'll be welcome in Germany. Germany needs a labor force. Germany has an older population, and as a result, a lot of these refugees coming out of Syria today are people who are doctors, lawyers, some of them
they're very
teachers,
well educated.
healthcare professionals, and of course skilled people. They're not usually a refugee class, which many times have just sheer, laborers and just sheer workers without any skills or craft. Overlooking another area, not nearly as dense as in population-wise, but here's Libya, and we see and hear every day, not every day, but every week, about a boat that is capsized trying to get to Greece, straight up from this part of Libya right here, which has difficulty because it's still in contention with the Libyan government, and as a result, this is the area right through here where you'll find on any given day a news report of 60 people lost their lives in a boat that overturned. And the other areas from the area of Tripoli straight across to Italy, trying to make it through here. And then again, for instance, I'll hear on the news occasionally, 40 people lost their life in a little boat that they contracted to try to get from Libya to Italy. The idea is in Italy, and certainly if they can get into the economic union of the EU, they can pretty much go to any country there, and some will welcome them more than others, but they're pretty loose as far as allowing individual countries in the European Union to accept or reject refugees. And so there are some of them, like the Netherlands, I believe, certainly France somewhat, Germany in particular, Austria somewhat, for instance, that'll welcome these refugees. I heard in the news the other day, can't see it here, but way up in Iceland up here, they would welcome up to 10,000 Syrian refugees in Iceland.
Which is a long distance from home and cold.
God almighty. I mean, I can't imagine a Syrian coming out of this environment geographically in Iceland, but it would make a story, wouldn't it, to say the least.
And so you really have I don't want to use the term exodus, but a lot of people who are on the move. They've been displaced.
Absolutely.
Looking for something else.
And they're following the traditional patterns of migration all over the world, from east to west, and from south to north. This is a traditional, for centuries, I guess, at least the last century, of the migratory patterns, if you're looking for work or if you're in ordinary migration. Refugees are following those same patterns, from east to west and from north to south.
History is repeating itself
in this sense, it really is, see. And of course, you wonder about nations like, like Saudi Arabia. My goodness, they're so wealthy in Saudi Arabia. But there's something else in Saudi Arabia we don't realize. They are an extremely young country. Over 30% of their population is under the age of 15. And their actual density in their urban areas, and they've got a lot of desert out here where no one lives except a few Bedouin, but their actual density is over 300 people per square mile. Saudi Arabia will not allow anyone to come into Saudi Arabia to relocate in that country.
So they've kind of stopped the borders.
That's right. You can get a work visa, and they won't even issue that if you're past 50 or 55. That's the same way with all of these GCC or these Gulf Corporation countries. They're all monarchies, and they're all ruled by ruling families, and they're really, there's no place unless you have a work permit to be in that country as far as a legal resident, or certainly, trying to take up, for instance, residency there. Kuwait, which has an emir and a ruling family, you can't go into Kuwait unless you're on a work visa. The same way with little Bahrain right here. In fact, its population density is so high, and that's the point we don't think about, is that these countries all have high population densities. They don't want anybody else in to feed, to clothe, and to house. See, same way with Qatar right here, high population density, and this is an emir, E-M-I-R, emir here, here, and here, a king here. They have a series of emirs or kings in the United Arab Emirates. See, E-M-I-R, emir. And so they're filled with all the people they need, and their guest workers are coming from this part over here, from Pakistan, certainly from India, Sri Lanka, and some from Southeast Asia. And Oman, the Sultan of Oman, he wants no more else people in his country because they've got quite enough. Meanwhile, the Saudi Arabians, to make things more confusing, have taken it upon themselves, as the Russians are flying sorties in Syria today. Saudi Arabia continues to fly sorties into Yemen because Yemen has become a really disrupted country as far as the revolution is concerned, and the Saudis are taking one side more than the other, the Sunni side, and they're flying in here continually. And the supreme irony is that this is one of the poorest nations in the world by every UN standard, and this is one of the richest nations in the world.
Just right next to each other
right
on that
next
peninsula.
to each other.
Tying that together. So a lot of implications, and I imagine governments in Europe having to make decisions about refugees as they cross their borders. They're just really impacting a lot of people in that part of the world.
We certainly get to see, what Southeast Europe has done. We can't see, here's the bottom part of Hungary, and Hungary's put up a huge fence to keep these Syrians.
Don't come into our country.
That's right, and they're patrolling it. And Romania's been a little bit more kind, but they have so many internal problems and so much poverty in and of themselves. See, certainly here in the southeast part here, as far as Bulgaria, and certainly in the western part of Istanbul, or I should say Turkey, there are a lot of Muslim people here, and so there's the connect between Islamic or Muslim. There's Sunni Muslim, these are Sunni Muslim, and so forth. But yet the official policy and the stance of the government is go away. We don't want you here, and as I say, just bottom right along here as far as Hungary is concerned. They've built this huge 800-mile fence, and it's up and it's full with steel and cables and being patrolled.
Now, when people leave, as they are, and the refugees, are they hoping that someday they can return home? Is it something that,
That's always the hope.
The hope that,
That's
we're going to go here and work, but someday I want to go back to my country when things settle down?
Well, again, that's kind of like the patterns of labor migration. Mm-hmm. You see, we know that full well here in the United States because we have so many laborers here in the United States that come from Mexico. But their hope is to return to Mexico. They're not necessarily interested in staying here. And most refugees have a long hope, for instance, of going back home. Consider, if you please, the refugees right here in Jordan. Jordan today has probably about 1.5 million Palestinian refugees. Mm-hmm. And they had 1 million in 1948. That when Israel started, they really clamped down. They did some real harm to a lot of villages here. The Palestinians scared them very much. Several whole villages were just completely murdered. And as a result, refugees ran over into Jordan. And Jordan, since 1948, I've been in a number of huge refugee camps in Jordan and some also in the occupied territory. And these are Palestinians who had ordinarily lived in Israel. Now they've been there since 1948. And their hope yet is to return to Jordan after all this time.
So the next generation carries that dream on in many cases.
Even though in these refugee camps, now here's where it gets really interesting. The United Nations, not so much from Europe or the United States, the United Nations, and huge contributions from Saudi Arabia and the GCC are to help the Palestinians and have been ongoing for years in these refugee camps as far as food, shelter, clothing, meeting the basic needs. And so Saudis certainly have given of their money quite freely, in all honesty, but you can't come into their country.
They don't want you in their country.
That's right.
Now, do you see, I know when we visited last time you had been to Saudi Arabia and we talked about it, but as we see the oil industry changing, do you see effects on Saudi Arabia? And we're benefiting from low gas prices, which means there's low oil prices. How's that affecting a country like Saudi Arabia? I'll
tell you, Saudi Arabia, they have a lot of moxie, and I think they're really, and I don't mean to say this in any way uncharacteristically, but they're stubborn people. They're intransigent people. And they're bound, determined to keep oil prices low so as to keep the pressure on ISIS and Iran, because they're not going to get very far when the oil prices and the crude oil prices are so low. Well, meanwhile, Saudi Arabia in 2013 sent home over 200,000 guest workers that had papers, sent them back to Egypt, sent them back to Pakistan, certainly to India, and a lot of them were Egyptians, and some of them I think were also from Algeria, see, and opened those jobs up to their own people. Now that's kind of interesting because a lot of their own people they've had to learn on the job, how to work oil riggings, how to do those technical jobs.
They weren't doing it before, right?
They weren't, no. They were, many times the Saudis would subsidize the Saudi family. The lower quarter, for instance, of the people who were not entrepreneurs doing well and perhaps maybe were marginal as far as their skills were concerned, there was always what you would say was the king's dole. And as a result, take care of the people. See, those people are now having to go to work.
So kind of a change in their society.
A change in their society, but meanwhile, the Saudis had always imported all of this labor. And so that's a real change. And I know the people in Saudi Arabia were constantly talking about it when I was there, about, will these people learn how to work? Will they be as good as our guest workers were? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure they will. But now all of a sudden, you've seen this change in domestic policy in Saudi Arabia.
So affecting them. And when someone looks at a map of the region like we have, looking at just each of those countries, you can see the problems that have come up. And you mentioned ISIS, and that's something we hear every night on the news. And Americans still concerned. Is ISIS isolated over there? Is it something we need to worry about in the United States? The government comes out and says it's going to take a long time to control ISIS. Everybody's concerned, perhaps along those types of lines.
It's certainly moved into the neighborhood as far as eastern Syria and certainly western Iraq. And no one was quite prepared for the offensive that ISIS took and then taking over the city of Mosul. How do you capture a city? But they do it on the ground. This is where we concentrate our efforts as far as our air missions are concerned. A lot of drones. And it seems like Russia is concentrating more with the revolutionaries against the Assad government. And it seems like Russia is definitely wanting to prop up the Assad government. So is Iran. and Russia, and certainly the Assad government, so that they can try to get control, and hopefully then, for instance, they say squelch or bring real peace to this area, but it's going to be costly. And as a result, we thought that the Russians would go right into the Americans. Now you've got some real tricky problems. How do you separate at least the few machines we have in the air from the drones, as far as from the Russian machines, when they're both flying sorties in the air? I guess one's going one way, one's going the other. But nevertheless, this is getting really dicey in here. And I know with the appearance of Russia coming into this area here, well, right down here is Israel, and I know so many of the Armageddon folk talk about the bear coming in from the north.
Russians, the
The
bear.
Russian bear, and here's the Russians flying 100 sorties in 3 days in Syria, and Syria's right above Israel.
Well, what about Israel in the scope of things? Amidst all this trouble in the Arab world, and
Amazing.
They are still, hanging in there and holding their own.
Amazing. I was listening to an interview, Charlie Rose, the other night with Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and he's very firm about the defense of Israel. But you could tell that he was being held under the thumb of the United States not to get involved in any of these, Arab conflicts, and to stay outside of that fold and to be as tolerant as possible. But yet I understand the other night, for instance, there was a stabbing in Jerusalem by a Palestinian, and there were four, of an Israeli, and there were 4 Palestinians that were killed. And really the rate is so high, and I don't mean to diverge, but every time an Israeli gets killed, there's usually about 25 or 30 Palestinians, or the rate's about 3 to 1 in relationship. Well, no, it's higher than that, but I mean 30 to 1 or 25 to 1. And this brings me back to years ago in a Palestinian refugee camp, where this woman who was in her late 40s, she looked like she was 80, and she started crying. She told the interpreter from the UN, she says, "I'm a Palestinian woman. I've had 10 children. I'd have 10 children more. We Palestinian women can make more babies than the Israelis have bullets."
Determination to hold their own.
That's scary. That's scary, see? And so this it's a cauldron. It is an absolute crucible.
Staying firm with their beliefs and their points and so forth. Now, Egypt, I know we've talked in the past about Egypt, and at one time you were mentioning that Egypt's big business being tourism. Do you see an effect of all this unrest and just affecting tourism in the region?
Absolutely. However, I've known tourists who've been there in the last 2 or 3 years, and they said, "My God, they've been well taken care of." They still go up and down the Nile. No problems there. Their safety is pretty well guaranteed. They got the same situation that we had when I was there in 2002. Everywhere you go, and we were a group of 12 of us representing the Fulbright scholars in the country. We had a police escort, and we had an armed policeman in plain clothes on the coach with us. Every tourist I've ever talked to, if they were up and down the Nile, they've got that kind of security under the new regime. See, and they're hungry for tourist dollars. And poverty, Egypt has always been, again, a poor country, not nearly as poor as Yemen, or perhaps maybe Djibouti, and definitely Somalia. But certainly it's had its fair share, because they're so large, 80 million people, they all live in the Nile Valley. There's not a lot to do, There's, the labor force is there, but, the productivity, at any rate, the tourism has always been the big thing, but it's really slackened off. People from Europe are not coming the way they used to. The Japanese are not coming at all. And the Americans, we ranked about 17th as far as tourism among all the countries when I was there in 2002 in Egypt, and they're not coming.
They're not coming to make that trip because they're concerned.
We're talking about people who have money to spend who aren't coming.
So now, working at Missouri Southern, teaching and working with students, what do you got a feel for in the classroom, student interest or concerns of what's happening over there? Is it something that we see in the newspaper, we pick up the Time magazines and so forth, but on a college level, do you hear students who are concerned about these types of things?
On occasion. It certainly isn't as important as Friday Night Lights, or perhaps maybe upcoming World Series or Super Bowl, Gosh, students, like everyone else, seems that we've gotten them so much into the business of just trying to stay alive, meet all ends and take care of all bills, still try to keep their degree program alive and going, and we're trying to increase tuition and get more money from them to operate this school because the state's falling back. We have our own problems
We've got
here.
our problems here,
that pretty
right.
much doesn't. But occasionally we'll really, and particularly a class that I teach called the Arab World. That's where it's front and center every day. Another class I teach is Introduction to International Studies, and students are, semi-interested in that, but mostly they're freshmen and sophomore in that class, see? But the Arab World is an upper division class, and it has a lot of students in it that are juniors and seniors, and they're more concerned. They know questions to ask. A number of them are veterans and have been there, have served time. And it's always my pleasure to have a veteran who's been there who really shakes it, says, yeah, he says, kind of know what you're talking about. That's what we saw, that sort of thing. See, particularly in their duty in Iraq or somewhere.
Right. And we have a number of students that are veterans of the Iraq wars and situations. Their perspective, do you ever get a feeling from someone who, I went there, I fought, and now
Very
look
much
where they're
so.
at now? Very
much so. And sometimes we've even had a few arguments. I can always remember years ago a real argument in the class about, I boldly stand up and say, there are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. In 2002, 2003, I would say, there isn't. They said, well, how can you be so bold to say that? Well, if there were, at that time, Israel would have flown in, destroyed them, and flown out. Best Air Force in the world, perhaps maybe in Israel, trained everything they need in the United States, and they don't hesitate to invade another country, bomb them, and leave. We saw that in their search for certainly the Palestinian organization, when it moved from place to place between Lebanon and certainly, of course, into Libya and then into Egypt. But my point is that the weapons of mass destruction weren't there, and I know we had this, every time I see him, I said, no weapons, and he says, well, okay, this sort of thing, see, and it was kind of fun to do that. But indeed, the veterans who have been there, they're pretty serious, and they have a knowledge of the geography. Right. They have a knowledge of the place, and that's something that you just can't imagine until you've been there. I must, pause and say... You're
looking at a map, it's just a map with lines, but you don't realize
exactly.
The terrain.
And those crazy lines have been to accommodate tribes who want to come this way or that way. Yeah. See, as you try to fill out a nation state, there's no reason why Jordan should have this anvil going way over into Iraq, swinging back underneath Syria, coming up against the southern part of Lebanon, and then down against Israel. I mean, look at the configuration of Jordan there. But these were tribal people, Bedouin, who wanted to come in this direction, not go over into Iraq. And so, same way, how would you have something like this in Yemen? See?
That little line at the bottom with the little dip in it, right.
Exactly, see? And then it really gets confusing when you look in Africa, because that's when you can see the tribal influences on their land boundaries in Africa, carefully drawn out to accommodate, in the Congo, this tribe here, that tribe up here, what have you, instead of, we're used to straight lines in America.
The states have straight lines pretty much unless there's a river.
Well, that's because we don't understand tribes, and even the effect of tribes yet in a place like Syria and Iraq.
So there's still influence from
very much so, yes. And in fact, much of their elections that they're free and democratic in Iraq, you'll find tribes voting together in, sort of a pact.
They become a political party of their own, in a sense?
That's exactly right. Well, I wouldn't say they'll support candidates who are running in a particular party. That's right, see? And as a result, they form sort of a voting bloc in that respect. I might indicate, for instance, that we always look at Damascus because in the history of the world, Judy, this is a city that's the oldest city that's been intact since it started in the oasis there at Damascus. It's somewhere around 4,000 years old, and it's never been destroyed, like some other cities. Jerusalem has been destroyed and rebuilt, and destroyed and rebuilt, but Damascus has been intact for nearly 4,000 years. And we're just hoping that it's a beautiful city with boulevards and gardens, the hanging gardens. It was in Baghdad, but Damascus had its own beauty, and Aleppo was a beautiful city that's been pretty much beaten down. Now, out here in this area, just a little south and east of Aleppo, right out in here, is where Palmyra is. And the ISIS people have been destroying that, because of the human figures that are there.
So we're destroying archaeology, the
artifacts.
That's
exactly right, see? And Palmyra is an example of the Roman cities that were all up and down here by the ancient Romans. This was their playground in the wintertime. They would come over here and spend time and hunt and have a good time in the wintertime when it was still cold back here in Rome, see? And so people of means. And so you had what was known as the Decapolis of the 10 cities. Palmyra is a beautiful ancient Roman ruins, and I guess it's being destroyed pretty much so as far as we speak, you know, by ISIS. They don't believe in any image of human beings. Everything is the Word of God. And so therefore, you know, in Islam we have no idea of what Muhammad looked like. We have no idea of his dimensions as a man, because everything is on the Word of God and nothing on the man.
So
they have no statues.
Of people are torn down.
Exactly. See, the representations of peoples, or perhaps the Roman gods, or goddesses, or God forbid goddesses, you know, that sort of thing, will be destroyed. See, and that's kind of the extremism that we're seeing come forth in the world today, and that bothers the Saudis. I know it bothers them very much, because you know they believe in the Word, but they're not that extreme about it.
The different extreme. Where they're getting.
The Saudis respect other people's cultures, their images, and certainly, of course, what that's supposed to represent. And again, that's maybe the difference between Shiite, Sunni, and the Sufi brands as far as the Islamic religion is concerned.
And this is a topic that Americans are still learning about. I mean, we've had the wars over there, but it's still something that people are trying to grasp.
It is so confusing. It makes a civil war look elementary.
Our civil war in the United States.
Our civil war, yeah. I mean, civil war stand up. We know the battles, the battlefields. One side sought the other. So this is so confusing and so involuntary, because we could get into groups like Hezbollah. We could get into groups, for instance, you know, certainly that are more localized, and they factor into this. And who controls them?
All these different splinter groups coming together.
Oh my goodness, yeah. And there are all kinds of Islamic groups here in Somalia, but they're their own group of people. They may be warlords, and we consider Somalia pretty much a failed state. You know, and we're really worried about Yemen falling into the same way. And my goodness, this once proud country here of Syria and Iraq both.
Different.
I just never thought I would see that 20 years ago.
So from an American perspective, there's a lot of things to think about, a lot of things to look towards for the future. I think
I don't think we know what to think about, because there's so much, except what we might grasp a little bit on the news.
Well, Dr. Gubera, I thank you very much for coming and shedding some light for our viewers. And, you know, as we say, we hear about it all the time on the news, but being able to kind of eyeball it, at least through a map, get some ideas to let our viewers know more about it.
It's very kind of you to invite me, Judy. I always enjoy working with you and responding to your questions. I hope I've had some input here. I feel very sensitive about this, because I've been there so many times, and this is disturbing to me.
Well, thank you for being here. And I'd like to thank you, the viewers, for being here as well. I'm Judy Stiles. Hope you can join me again next week at the same time on this station. We'll see you then.